At a school where your name matters more than your character, and where your skin color still silently determines how you're treated, a quiet black boy from a dusty farm on the edge of town is about to make everyone reconsider the prejudices they take for granted. It was supposed to be just another Tuesday morning at Jefferson High, a school known for its top test scores, prestigious college placements, and a student body that looked like it had been cut from the same privileged cloth. Tucked in the leafy suburbs of Atlanta, Georgia, Jefferson High was where last names carried weight, and the cars in the student parking lot cost more than most teachers' salaries. But on this particular morning, as sunlight crawled over the tall oak trees and warmed the brick buildings, something quietly powerful was about to unfold. Something that would challenge the hierarchy, rattle old prejudices, and remind everyone what dignity really looks like. Malik Johnson never fit the Jefferson mold. While most students arrived in designer sneakers, Malik walked the halls in scuffed-up work boots that still carried the scent of early morning soil. His hands bore the faint roughness of labor, not from gym workouts or football practice, but from real work, feeding livestock, baling hay, and mending fences on his grandfather's small farm just outside of town. Every day before the sun rose, Malik was up doing chores. He'd rinse the dirt off his face at 6:15, scarf down a plate of grits and eggs, then catch the 45-minute bus ride into a school that often made him feel invisible. He was 16, tall for his age, with deep brown eyes that rarely made direct contact unless absolutely necessary. Malik didn't talk much. He'd learned that silence was safer, that drawing too much attention meant inviting the wrong kind. And at a school like Jefferson, where black students made up less than 10% of the population, and most came from wealthy families or sports scholarships, Malik stood out, and not in the way that earned you popularity. His classmates didn't know about the early mornings. They didn't know about the sacrifices his grandfather had made to send him here, or about the evenings he spent studying by the flicker of an old lamp in a house where the power bill sometimes came second to the feed bill. All they saw was the quiet black kid who sat in the back, wore worn-out jeans, and didn't seem to belong. But Malik belonged more than they knew. Jefferson High's grand facade masked a culture of quiet judgment. Teachers praised the confident, polished students who reminded them of their own children. They looked through kids like Malik, kids who didn't raise their hands, who sometimes nodded off in class because 5 hours of sleep had to be enough. They assumed he didn't care. They assumed he wasn't trying. Malik's presence in the school had always been a kind of quiet resistance against a system that had never made space for kids like him. And though he rarely spoke, his eyes missed nothing. He saw the smirks, the shared glances, the way teachers' voices softened for other students and sharpened around him. He saw how assumptions hung in the air like dust you couldn't sweep away. That morning, as Malik stepped off the bus and walked toward the school entrance, he carried with him more than a backpack weighed down by textbooks. He carried the pressure of expectations he never asked for, the burden of representation, in the quiet dignity passed down from a grandfather who taught him that your worth isn't measured by how the world sees you, but by how you carry yourself when it doesn't. In his right front pocket was a folded index card with bullet points about the Civil War. He'd stayed up reviewing it even though he could barely keep his eyes open. Mr. Booker, the janitor who sometimes let Malik in through the back door when it rained, had even offered him a thermos of black coffee and said, "Big day today, huh?" Malik just nodded. He knew Ms. Simmons, his 11th grade U.S. history teacher, would be calling on someone to speak today, and she had a habit of choosing him. Ms. Simmons was the kind of teacher who loved facts, timelines, and a good essay written in Times New Roman font, double-spaced. She also had a habit of talking down to students who didn't mirror her own expectations. Malik knew he was on her radar, not because he was outstanding, but because he wasn't. The school bell rang, and the hallways came alive with chatter, laughter, and the clatter of sneakers on polished floors. But Malik's steps were slower, more deliberate. He wasn't walking into just another class period. He was walking into a moment that would test more than his memory of dates and battles. It would test his character, his patience, and the quiet strength he had inherited from a man who had spent his entire life being underestimated and still managed to build something real. And in less than an hour, everything was about to change. Malik slipped quietly into his seat near the back of the classroom, setting down his backpack with care, like he didn't want to disturb the air around him. The walls of Miss Simmons' history room were lined with colorful posters about the founding fathers and the Constitution, but Malik had long stopped expecting those words, freedom, equality, liberty, to mean much within those four walls. Ms. Simmons, with her iron blouse and clipped speech, stood at the front with her usual air of restrained impatience. She adjusted her glasses, scanned the classroom, and then, right on cue, her eyes landed on Malik. "Mr. Johnson," she said crisply, folding her arms, "why don't you enlighten us on the causes of the Civil War?" There was no malice in her tone, at least none that could be quoted or written up. But everyone in the room could feel it, that faint, cutting edge in her voice that only came out when she spoke to Malik. It was like a coded message. "Let's see how the farm boy handles this one." Malik hesitated. He had the answer, at least most of it, but his mind was slow that morning, weighed down by the 4:30 a.m. wake-up call, the chores, and the long bus ride. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out fast enough. Ms. Simmons didn't wait. "I see," she said with a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Well, maybe if you spent more time focusing on your studies instead of whatever it is you do out in the fields, you wouldn't be struggling with basic history." A few students snickered. Malik felt his face flush. He could feel the weight of every eye in the room turning toward him, some with curiosity, some with pity, others with quiet satisfaction. Then she added with a tone so smooth it almost passed for casual, "Honestly, Mr. Johnson, not everyone is meant for academics. Some people are better suited to practical work. Maybe you should stick to what you know. Feeding pigs, plowing dirt. That's a respectable life, after all." The room went silent. Even those who laughed earlier shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. No one wanted to be next. Malik's jaw tightened. He looked down at the desk, the surface worn and scribbled on. But all he saw was the face of his grandfather, weathered and proud, telling him time and again, "Don't let anyone decide who you are, son. You tell them with how you live." He stood slowly, his fingers curled tightly around the edge of the desk, knuckles white. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady. Not loud, but strong enough to cut through the hush. "I may not be as polished as the rest of the kids in here," he said, eyes locking with Ms. Simmons's. "But that doesn't mean I don't deserve respect." Ms. Simmons raised an eyebrow, unamused. "Then prove it," she said. "Or perhaps you prefer to leave my classroom." It was meant to end the conversation. Instead, it opened a wound. Malik didn't argue. He picked up his bag, his notebook, and walked out, his steps calm even as his heart pounded in his chest. He didn't look back, not once. He didn't need to see their faces. He'd seen them 100 times before. He walked out of that classroom carrying something heavier than any textbook. The full weight of being black, poor, and underestimated in a place that claimed to teach history, but never learned from it. The next morning, the air around Jefferson High felt different, charged, unsettled, like the quiet before a storm. Students milled around the courtyard, murmuring about what had happened in Miss Simmons's class. Some called it bold, others called it stupid. But everyone remembered the look on Malik's face when he walked out. Calm, proud, and carrying something that most people in that school didn't recognize. A quiet, inherited strength. At 8:13 a.m., just 2 minutes before the first period bell, a low, rhythmic thumping began to echo through the air. At first it was faint, just enough to make a few students glance up from their phones. Then the sound grew louder, more deliberate, drawing eyes skyward. And then they saw it. A sleek black helicopter was descending over the football field. Teachers ran to the windows. Students poured out of classrooms. Phones came out, fingers pointing. No one had ever seen anything like it at Jefferson High. The chopper touched down with practiced ease, blades still spinning, kicking up dust across the grass. The side door opened, and out stepped a tall black man in a dark gray suit, sharp as steel, shoulders square, presence unmistakable. His gait was slow, deliberate, but each step carried authority. It was Elijah Johnson. Few recognized him at first, but within minutes, whispers traveled faster than wildfire. Some knew the name from local business magazines, others from sponsorship banners hanging in the school's ag tech wing. Elijah Johnson wasn't just Malik's grandfather. He was a Georgia legend, a former sharecropper turned entrepreneur. He had built one of the South's largest sustainable farming operations. His produce supplied Whole Foods, luxury restaurants, even state contracts. He was the founder of the Johnson Agriculture Foundation, a nonprofit that funded scholarships and school programs across the state, including Jefferson High's very own Agriculture Science Lab and, ironically, the U.S. History Department. And right behind him, stepping out with quiet poise, was Malik. He wasn't the same kid who'd walked out of class the day before. His shoulders were pulled back, chin lifted just slightly higher, eyes calm but sharp. He didn't look angry, he looked ready. As they entered the main building, a hush fell over the students in the hallway. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Even the teachers fell silent. Ms. Simmons, who had just stepped out of the teacher's lounge, froze in place. Her usual crisp composure faltered as she locked eyes with the man she instantly recognized. Elijah Johnson, the man who had shaken hands with governors and hosted agriculture summits in D.C. She opened her mouth as if to greet him, but he spoke first. "I believe we need to talk," Elijah said, his voice low but firm, echoing through the tiled corridor. Of course, Mr. Johnson," she stammered, trying to recover. "This is unexpected." "I imagine it is," he replied, reaching into his coat and pulling out a folded sheet of paper. Especially for someone who didn't expect a student like Malik to be anything more than a name on a roll call. He handed her the paper, an official funding confirmation letter from the Johnson Foundation. Her hands trembled slightly as she read it. "I understand you oversee the history program my foundation supports," Elijah continued, his tone still calm, but now sharper. "And that you used your position yesterday to diminish my grandson, not for his academic performance, but for where he comes from, for what he looks like." Ms. Simmons looked around, realizing the hallway was no longer empty. Dozens of students stood frozen, listening, watching. "I raised Malik to work hard, to stand tall, and to treat others with respect, even when it's not returned," Elijah said. "I didn't raise him to be silent when someone tries to put him in a box he doesn't belong in." He looked directly into Ms. Simmons' eyes, steady and unapologetic. "Maybe it's time you reconsider what kind of history you're really teaching." Ms. Simmons stood frozen, the paper still in her hands, though her eyes weren't reading anymore. Her face had paled a shade lighter, and the sharpness that once ruled her posture had softened into visible discomfort. She glanced around at the growing crowd of students and faculty who had gathered in the hallway, all watching in complete silence. Elijah Johnson didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His presence alone made the tiled corridor feel smaller, heavier. His calm was razor sharp, each word chosen with surgical precision. "I built that lab," he said, his eyes locked on hers. "The one your students tour every spring, the greenhouse your department takes so much pride in. That was my donation. The textbooks in your classroom, paid for by my foundation." Ms. Simmons swallowed hard, her lips parting slightly, but no words came. "I don't say that to boast," he continued. "I say that to remind you that you're standing on ground that folks like me helped build, brick by brick, dollar by dollar, not for favoritism, not for praise, but for opportunity for every child, including the ones who show up in boots, with dirt under their fingernails." A few murmurs rippled through the crowd. A junior named Tyler, usually one of the louder ones in class, now stood stone still, eyes wide. "You saw my grandson," Elijah went on, "and you didn't see a student. You saw a stereotype. You assume because he's quiet, because he doesn't come from wealth, because he's black, that he wasn't worth your time." Miss Simmons opened her mouth again. "Mr. Johnson, I assure you—" He raised a hand. She stopped. "No," he said, voice firm but level. "You don't get to assure me of anything today. Yesterday, you spoke to my grandson like he was beneath you. You used your authority not to teach, but to belittle. That's not education. That's arrogance wrapped in tenure." Behind him, Malik shifted slightly. He hadn't said a word since they arrived, but now, seeing his teacher so visibly shaken, he took a step forward. His voice, though soft, carried just as clearly as his grandfather's. "I'm not asking for special treatment," Malik said, his eyes steady. "I just want to be treated like everyone else, with respect." Ms. Simmons's gaze dropped to the floor. I understand," she said. "I apologize, Malik." Elijah nodded once. "Good," he said, "because respect doesn't come from your salary or your title. It comes from how you treat people, especially when no one's watching." Then he turned to Malik, placing a hand gently on his grandson's shoulder. The message was clear. "You didn't just endure, you rose." In the days that followed, the atmosphere at Jefferson High shifted, subtly at first, but unmistakably. The story of what happened that morning spread faster than any school rumor. Not just about the helicopter or the man in the sharp suit, but about what he said, and more importantly, what Malik stood for. Students who had once overlooked him now nodded when he passed in the hallway. Some clapped him on the back between classes, a few the same ones who had once laughed under their breath when Ms. Simmons mocked him, now looked at him with something that resembled respect, or maybe guilt. Even teachers who had never taken notice of Malik before began to engage with him differently. They asked about his opinions in class, invited his thoughts on group projects, not out of pity, but as if they had finally realized he had something to say all along. But for Malik, it wasn't about the attention. It wasn't about recognition or even the apology. It was about reclaiming something that had been denied to him quietly every single day he'd walked into that school. Dignity. He still got up before dawn. He still fed the chickens, checked the fencing, and helped his grandfather before catching the same 45-minute ride to school. His boots were still dusty, his jeans still worn. Nothing about his routine had changed, except how he was seen. And yet the real change wasn't just in how others saw him, it was in how he saw himself. For so long, Malik had learned to shrink, to keep his head down, to keep quiet, to endure. But after that day, something inside him shifted, not in a loud, dramatic way, but in small, steady choices. He sat closer to the front of the class. He raised his hand when he had something to say. He volunteered for a history debate, not because he needed to prove anything to Ms. Simmons, but because he finally believed his voice mattered. As for Ms. Simmons, she was never quite the same. Her posture was still upright, her lessons still rigorous, but her tone had softened. She listened more. She called on students who usually went ignored. And though she never spoke about that morning publicly, her actions showed she had heard every word Elijah Johnson said. One afternoon a few weeks later, she stopped Malik as he was leaving class. "You made your point," she said quietly, "and you did it with more grace than I deserved." Malik gave her a small nod. I just wanted to be treated fair, he replied. That's all. And that was everything. The deeper lesson lingered long after the dust from the helicopter had settled. In a school that prided itself on academic excellence and high achievement, a young black student had taught everyone something they hadn't found in textbooks, that true strength isn't about loud words or perfect grades. It's about standing tall when the ground isn't level and carrying yourself with honor, even when others don't. Because in the end, respect isn't given because of the clothes you wear or the money in your family's account. It isn't earned through a GPA or a trophy. It's earned in the quiet moments when no one's watching, when the odds are stacked against you, and you choose to carry your name, your roots, and your dignity with pride. Some stories don't need a dramatic finale. They speak the loudest in their quiet resolve. Malik Johnson didn't become class president. He didn't win a scholarship on the spot or get a standing ovation in the cafeteria. But what he gained was far more valuable. The affirmation that he mattered, just as he was. His boots still tracked dirt into the hallways. His hands still bore the roughness of early morning labor. But now each step he took through the doors of Jefferson High echoed differently. It wasn't louder, but it carried weight. The kind of weight that comes from having faced down judgment and stood his ground with dignity intact. In a school where appearances once said everything, Malik reminded them that substance is greater than style, that a young black student from a rural background can hold his head high, not because he changed to fit in, but because he stayed true to who he was. Elijah Johnson had shown them what legacy really means. Not money, not reputation, but values passed down through generations. Values rooted in resilience, respect, and quiet power. And Malik had carried that torch, not with defiance, but with calm, steady courage. This wasn't just about one student and one teacher. It was about a system that too often decides a child's potential based on zip code, skin color, or how much dirt is on their shoes. It was about the unspoken rules that say some voices matter more than others, and what happens when someone refuses to play by them. Malik's story is a reminder. Dignity can't be measured by your test scores or your last name. It's how you walk when no one believes in you. It's how you speak when you're told to be quiet. It's how you carry the weight of silence and turn it into something that demands to be heard. So the next time you see a kid who doesn't quite fit, don't write them off. Don't reduce them to where they came from. Because maybe, just maybe, they're not behind. They're just walking a different path. One that's slower, harder, but lined with something rare and unshakable. Dignity over discrimination. Always.